Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the Honest Youth Pastor YouTube channel, the channel that helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. Tonight, we are going to work through the passage that Raphael Warnock preached on, or the sermon we reviewed this week from Raphael Warnock. He actually preached on Matthew chapter 11. He specifically worked on verse 12, and we're going to be working through that today. Only not just verse 12, but the whole context of the passage that he was talking about. Now, if you want to go watch that sermon review because you haven't seen it yet, or you're just confused about what a sermon review is at all, down in the description, there's actually there's going to be a link for that. I want to make sure that's down there. Yeah, so that's down there. If you want to go down there and check that out, you can watch it. We have an edited version for those of you that can stick around the whole time, or we have the full version, which is about an hour and 20 minutes, and you can watch the whole thing as we work through it. Each week when we do those sermon reviews now, what we try to do is also go ahead and in another video, work through the passage that they were looking at so that we have a better idea about what they were looking at, if they handled it correctly, if they didn't handle it correctly, all of that. So that's what we're doing tonight. Let's go over to that screen. We're going to work through a couple different sections here. We want to start in Matthew again, chapter 11. This is the beginning of it. This isn't quite to chapter 12 yet, but this is the start of it. So if you turn there, or you can watch on the screen, whichever one, I'm going to kind of mark this up. Chapter 10, which we're not going to read tonight. Raphael Warnock didn't read it either, but it's Jesus sending out the disciples, equipping them, and then that's why verse 1 of this chapter 11 says, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there teaching and preaching in their cities. Now, when John Baptist heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" So the first thing we want to look at here is this question that is being presented. So John heard from prison about the deeds of the Christ. Now, it's very important to get a timeline here of what's going on, right? So in this passage, it's been about a year since John baptized Jesus, right? So we have the whole baptism, dove coming down, all of that. We all know that passage. So it's been about a year since that's happened. He has now been arrested by Herod. He's in prison. And for John, this is a little bit disorienting, and we really need to understand that. I think you guys have heard this before. If you haven't, maybe this is new news to you, but the Jews were looking for this Messiah to come that was going to be much like David, like King David. He was going to rule well. He was going to overthrow the powers that were over them, and that's kind of the Messiah they were looking for. And so John, at the time of the baptism, is confident that Jesus is definitely this Messiah. And so now we're about a year after that, or so, give or take, and John has been arrested in prison. He's been doing a variety of things, but one of the things that seems to have really got him there was preaching that Herod should not have taken his brother's wife. And there's a whole bunch there. If you go watch the sermon review, there's a link in that sermon review that kind of walks through the Herods, and it's very interesting history. Don't have time to get into it, but that's why John says is heard from prison about the deeds of the Christ. Now, Jesus isn't doing the things that John thought that he should be doing as the Christ, right? Jesus is just teaching and preaching and healing, and John is confident that if this was the Christ, why am I in jail, right? Why am I still in jail? If I'm the one that was preparing the way, if I'm the one that baptized you, and you're the Messiah, this promised one, why am I in jail right now then? This isn't kind of how John thinks it should be working. So he asked Jesus through his disciples, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" Now, this really sets the tone for the passage, right? We're going to see the passage kind of worked out as we work through all of 11. But the tone is that Jesus is coming in a way that they did not expect this Messiah to come. And this sort of sets the tone for this whole passage of I thought, you're it, right? But you're not doing the things that I thought you were going to do. Now, verse 4. And Jesus answered, "Go and tell John what you have heard. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and deaf are hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor shall have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me." So he gives them these words of Isaiah, something that John would have been fully aware of, he would have known. And so Jesus essentially in this passage is saying, yes, I'm it, but you're still in prison. And there's a lot behind this. Obviously, Jesus leaves out, the prisoners being free, and a lot of pastors have speculated about like that, leaving that out purposefully for John being in prison is really saying like, yes, I am the one, but this isn't going to go the way you think it's going to go. And so John obviously stays there, eventually gets beheaded. Now we go into verse 7. So at this point, John's disciples have come to Jesus. Jesus has answered them. And then in verse 7 it says, and as they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowd concerning John. Right? So you have to understand like contextually what's happening here. The crowd heard what Jesus has told John's disciples. And this crowd knows about John. John was pretty well known as far as we can tell within the text. And so they're asking like in their head, right? You have to think like, how are you processing this then? Right? So you're sitting there and you're hearing all of this about John, and Jesus says this, hey, I'm the one essentially. And then his disciples leave. And Jesus then turns and begins to speak to the crowd concerning John. And he says this, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? And what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothes? Behold, those who wear soft clothes are the king in the king's houses. What did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, more than a prophet. This is whom it was written. Behold, I am sending a messenger before your face who will prepare the way for you. So what he's saying is like, why'd you go out to see John? Well, you went out to see John because you assumed correctly John is the prophet, right? John is the one that was preparing the way, and so you were right in that way. So in doing so, Jesus isn't saying, John's no good. You shouldn't have listened to John. That's not what he's saying at all. In fact, he's really propping John up. In fact, in verse 11, he goes on to say, truly I say to you, among those who were born of women, there is no one greater than John the Baptist. So he's building John up here as he's also telling them like this is why you came out, right? You perceived correctly. John was a prophet. He was preparing this way. He was baptizing for repentance. So he's really setting this tone that like, yes, John's in prison. John is, he even says in verse 11 here, there is no one among those born of woman that has arisen, no one greater than John. Saying, yeah, this, like, it's not that John has done something wrong in the eyes of God, and therefore this is why he's in prison. John was a prophet. He was preparing the way, Jesus is saying, and yet the one who is the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John, and this is Warnock's main verse. All right, so I really want to cover this because this was his main thing. So this is verse 12, okay? Let me get over that real quick. Verse 12. From the day of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. This was his main verse. So if you have watched the sermon review, if you do look at the sermon review, what you're going to see is he really, really, really focuses in on that verse. In fact, he compares January 6th to that verse. He compares just violence of poverty, violence of what else did he say? Violence of language and violence of prejudice, I think, were the three things he connects to this violence, to this verse. Now, in reality, you have to understand, again, contextually what Jesus is saying. He's already confirmed that John was a prophet. He's already basically told John's disciples in no less words that, yes, I am the one. John was preparing the way for me. Turns to the people and says, John was a great prophet. And then in verse 12 says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is what's really... in the sermon review, I said that most commentaries are going to say that this violence that's talking about is the violence that kind of John is actually suffering, like this pushback amongst people about the kingdom coming, them not liking that. Right. And then the violent take it by force being, there's some speculation, of course, in this given time, there was a group of people known as the Zealots. We have, for example, Judas is sort of in that same vein, trying to sort of, as we see through the Gospels, like kind of goad Jesus into like doing something, being this like violent messianic figure that they wanted. And so there's some speculation that this is sort of what's being talked about, that, they don't like what John is saying. And there are some groups, the Zealots in particular, that want to take the kingdom by force and sort of force this kingdom. Now, the interesting thing is that is the most common reading for sure. but the language actually can be, depending on how you take it, set up a different way. So for example, let me see if I can pull this up here. I don't know if I have this ready. Let me see where we got here. I should have had this pulled up and ready to go. Yes. So another, man, this is bright. I'm sorry. Another example of this as far as how it could be translated. And this is how some of the Jewish scholars that I looked up translated it, is more in the lines of, since the days of John the Baptist, the kingdom has been advancing with force, and forceful people are taking hold on it. So that is an interesting take on it. Now, again, that's the lesser accepted translation of the verse, but it is a very interesting take on the verse. And it sort of really fits more in line with everything we're talking about here. So just so you know, like, it can, depending on how the language is sort of set up, because of the word usage there, is interesting depending on kind of how you use the Greek. So it can be, and the most generalized translation of this verse is that the kingdom of heaven is suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. But there is another reading that is accepted, which is that the kingdom is forcefully advancing, and those that want to take hold on it are mightily taking hold on it as well. So there's two translations there. Either way you take it, it is not how Warnock presents it, right? So he's connecting the violence toward the kingdom being violence toward things that are very modern. He's talking about poverty. He's talking about language. He's talking about preferential treatment. This is not what is in the text. Jesus is being very specific, that saying, since John the Baptist has been proclaiming this repentance until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. Now, I'm of the mind, again, I'm not I think we all know this. I'm no Greek expert, but I think the secondary translation here is pretty good, even though it's not necessarily the most common, which is that the kingdom of heaven is going forward in strength, and the people have been trying to take it, are pursuing it with might. So anyway, that was his main verse, and I just want to break that down. So within the context, and I think I explained it within the sermon review fairly well, hopefully, is that the way Warnock uses this verse to attribute it to things such as January 6th, or to attribute it to modern political things that are happening, just don't fit. There are plenty of times, especially now, that Jesus could connect violence toward, kingdoms. He could have easily referenced the Maccabean revolt. He could have easily referenced a number of different uprisings, smaller ones, of course, that had happened during or before this time, but he doesn't. He's specifically talking about the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent have taken it by force, assuming we're using this translation. And essentially saying, look this is what's happening when the kingdom is talked about. There's this violence that's taken toward it, and people are trying to utilize it for their own gain, essentially, which is also, again, it's a good translation. Either way works, essentially, is what's happening. But Warnock's translation here doesn't at all, because he's trying to connect it to modern events. That being said, let's move on. So he says, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears, let him hear. Again, setting this John up as the prophet, the one that has been prophesied, just to set the way. Now, this is where Warnock stopped. He doesn't get past verse 15 because he doesn't need to, right? In his sermon, when he's preaching the sermon, he's not really concerned about anything but verse 12 that I've got underlined in blue, because he wants to draw out of verse 12 what he wants to draw out of verse 12. And then apply it to a modern context, which doesn't work, because that's not what Jesus is talking about. The context here is very clearly that the Messiah has come, but people are not understanding, they're confused about the way that he's going about it. John, for example, sets that tone at the very beginning. He goes, "Are you the one, or should we look for another?" And then Jesus sets forth saying, John's not wrong. He's seeing things in a way that's not super clear right now. And then verse 16, we see this again. It says, "But what shall I compare this generation to? Like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their playmates. We played the flute, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating or drinking, and they said, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they said, look at him, a glutton, a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom justifies her deeds." This picture that's set up is basically like that he sets up for them is a picture of children in a marketplace, and they're there and they're saying, hey, we did this for you and you're not doing what we want you to do. He said, so we played the flute and you did not dance. He said, this generation's like children saying, we sang a dirge and you did not mourn. He's setting up this picture again. Remember, the context of 11 is this unmet expectations of what the Messiah was supposed to look like. And he's already explained, like, John's confused about it. He says John's the greatest, he's the greatest prophet, and he did prophesy correctly, but this isn't the way that it's happening in a way that he didn't expect. And this generation as well are like children that are saying, hey, we did this thing and you're not operating the way we want you to. We played the flute, but you didn't dance. We sang a dirge, but you didn't mourn. And he says in verse 18 rather, for John came neither eating or drinking, and you said he is a demon. And the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, look at him, a glutton, a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. He's saying, like, you're expecting one thing, but that's not how it's going to go. So one of I think the greatest applications we can get from this is the application that Jesus is trying to convey to the people that he's talking to. That John is very confused about Jesus being the Messiah now because he's not doing the things that he thinks he should be doing. Just as this generation that Jesus says in verse 16 is saying, hey, we did this thing and you're not like operating like we think you should. And he says, and we came in a certain way, and you go, yeah, but that's not the way we want you to come. And the application, I think, for us, especially reading this, is to realize that God operates often in ways that we don't, like, we would rather him do X, Y, Z, and he decides to do A, B, C. Because he operates in the way he wants to operate. So oftentimes we think that, hey, if I do these things, then God will then do this thing. And not that this passage is necessarily saying that he won't. It's just saying, like, especially in this context of you expect the Messiah to come this way, and I'm not coming the way you thought I was going to come. This actually plays out within the rest of the Gospel of Matthew also. But specifically here, pulling out John's expectations and showing how he was just wrong in how it was going to come about. He was right about Jesus being the Messiah, but he was incorrect about how that Messiah was going to show himself. And the generation itself as well, given the example in verse 17, says, hey, you're supposed to do this, but you're doing this. And Jesus goes, this is how you're acting. So I think one of the very interesting takeaways from Matthew chapter 11, when you're looking at verses 1 through 18 or 19 specifically, that we can learn from, that we can take away, is that oftentimes we are like the people that Jesus is talking to. Like, we expect God to operate in a certain way because that's just our expectation. But oftentimes God will subvert our expectations and work in ways that we don't expect. We see this oftentimes in like sickness, right? I don't think it was a video on here. I think it was a video on Instagram that I made talking about this lady that goes to my church that had been out of church for the last 2 months essentially because she had chronic pain. And then through that pain, she actually was able to pray more, read the Bible more, really dive into God's word more, become closer to him through that situation. And without that situation happening, which she would not have wanted, that would not have occurred. All that to say, it's the same sort of concept here. Like, there's lots of things that we think, God, give me more time in order to come closer to you. But we're not thinking, put me flat on my back for 2 months to do that. But he works in ways outside oftentimes than we expect him to work. In this specific case, he's working, he's bringing forth the kingdom of heaven in a way that they did not expect it to occur. They expected him to come as a mighty warrior coming. John specifically, the way he words is very like a judge that is coming to, just bring on the wrath. And he doesn't see Jesus doing that. So then he starts to question, like, are you this Messiah? And Jesus says, yes, I am. I am that Messiah. but it's not going to go down basically the way that you thought it was going to go down. Turns around to the people and says, John was a great prophet. He was the one that was laying forth essentially this pathway. But you guys are confused as well. Like, you think that we played a song, but you didn't dance. We did a dirge, but you didn't mourn. He says, you're expecting one thing to happen because of the way you're doing things, and that's not the way it's going to occur. Anyway, very interesting passage. Altogether, I think if you watch the review, please, if you haven't, I'd be honored if you'd actually go listen to it or watch it. But essentially, Warnock obviously butchers the passage because he uses verse 12 from that day, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. And he very much just ignores the context of what's happening in the passage and immediately applies it to now. Which there is application. Hopefully I've laid that out clearly to you, but the application isn't some political violent uprising of now, but rather it is the subversion of how God works in ways that we don't expect him to work to bring about something that we want him to do, but he does it in ways that are totally unexpected from our perspective. And especially as we enter, the Christmas season, that's a great reminder that, like, oftentimes, and even the early church, as they kind of spread out after Jesus' resurrection, even the Roman Empire, they really liked strong gods that would come down and punish people. And the Christians have this gentle Jesus that died in our place for our sins, and it was so subversive to the way that it was, the Messiah was expected to come. And it was very countercultural to the Romans and what they expected. So, guys, hopefully that was helpful. If it was, make sure you like, share, all that cool thing. Leave a comment below if you think I was off on something. Again, this was not a deep dive into the language. It was very much a generalization of the passage. But suffice to say, I think it shows that Warnock did not handle the passage well and really just eisegeted it to his own advantage and his own political ends, which happens way too often, not just with Warnock, but with many, many pastors. And we need to watch out for that. So make sure, if you haven't watched the sermon review, that is in the description as well. I'd love your feedback on that. Guys, thanks for watching. Thanks for being cool. I'll talk to you next time.